Started. Um, I have some introductory remarks to make. Welcome everybody, and that'll give folks a chance to get in before Shannon starts. So good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2020 Scholars Lecture. If you haven't already, please mute your mics until it's time for the Q&A. Please do turn on your video if you're willing to let us see your faces. It's nice to see folks in this period of coronavirus and COVID-19. We've been having the Scholars Lecture for probably a couple of decades now. Certainly since I arrived, it had been well underway. And as far as I know, this is the first time ever that it's taken place online in a WebEx format. And so I think it's a moment to mark. I think as we all know, it's not the same as all of us are teaching online and WebExing meetings online. It's not the same online as it would be if we were gathered together in Merton Hall, sharing a wonderful meal and being able to, chat and exchange hugs and all of that stuff. But I think one of the upsides to this format that I was thinking about earlier today is the fact that a lot of folks can join us virtually who wouldn't necessarily be able to join us. And I see some folks have joined us from outside of the DMV. And so welcome, especially to all of you who are coming in from elsewhere. We might need to rethink how this works moving forward. Certainly, I hope we will return to having the Scholars Lecture next year in person, but perhaps we want to continue to think about an electronic format so folks can join us. So welcome to everybody. I have just a few remarks. For those of you who don't know, the Scholars Lecture was conceived as a way to acknowledge and recognize our own. So annually, the faculty, I think that's Wendy's mic. Annually, the faculty in Women and Gender Studies and the Executive Committee in particular identify a scholar in our midst to deliver a lecture for us to be provocative, thoughtful, and really think about the ways in which we're contributing scholarship at Mason and beyond. And many of you whose faces I see on the WebEx are people who have delivered those lectures. And so thank you for coming back. But it's a wonderful opportunity to remind folks that it's not just people we bring to Mason, it's people at Mason who are doing amazing work. A few years ago, we also started a tradition at the Scholars Lecture where we recognize graduating MAIS students for excellence who graduated in the previous year for excellence for the most outstanding thesis and the most outstanding project. And generally, we invite them to the lecture and they stand up and we honor them. I hope that they're online. I'm not sure because I can't see everyone. We are in the process of having them. They have pre-recorded thank yous, sort of acceptance speeches, which I understand from David that we will have up at the end of the week. But I wanted to note that this year, the Outstanding Thesis Award is given to Wanjiku for her work on queer African tourism. And the Outstanding Project Award is given to Erica Kern, who developed and proposed a public-private partnership to address high maternal mortality in the district. Both of those certainly have COVID-19 implications. And so unfortunately, we're not hearing from them today, but congratulations to Wanjiku and to Erica. Their projects and theses were outstanding. And it's certainly, so we can be all giving them a round of applause. Yes, thanking them for their contributions. And look for those videos. Wanjiku is still on campus getting her PhD now in cultural studies. So if you run into Wanjiku virtually or in person, be sure to give her a hearty congratulations. We're also starting a new way of thinking about recognizing faculty who are core program and affiliate faculty. So I loved that little wave. So turn on your video for me now if you can. We'd love to have you wave if you are a core program or affiliate faculty or emeritus faculty in Women and Gender Studies. You're teaching classes, doing research. We want to see all those. Turn them on. If you have your video, yay! I can't see everybody, but I hope you're watching as a way of sort of building community and reminding us of how deep and broad our faculty truly are. So folks from all over the place, members of the executive committee, our new interim director is joining us as well. So very exciting to see all of you, and look forward to that in the future, where we're going to think about this as a way to recognize and visually see and represent women in gender studies faculty. But now for the featured event. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce the 2020 Scholars Lecturer, Professor Shannon Davis. Shannon Davis is Professor of Sociology, Director of Graduate Studies in Sociology, and Chair of the Faculty Senate. You might know she had a little something to do with that presidential search that we just had. Thank you, Shannon. She earned her BA in Sociology from the University of North Carolina, Asheville, and her MA and PhD in Sociology from North Carolina State University. She was a postdoctoral scholar at the Carolina Population Center at Chapel Hill prior to coming to Mason in 2006. Dr. Davis's research focuses on the mechanisms that reproduce and potentially undermine inequality. One vein of her work focuses on the negotiation of family life, examining how family members negotiate the intersections of paid and unpaid work in their daily lives, and how gender inequality is reproduced in families. Her research on whether married couples' responses to the recent economic recession could lead to greater gender equality was funded by the American Sociological Association. A second focus of her research is on the construction and maintenance of beliefs about gender or gender ideologies. Dr. Davis studies how gender ideologies inform decisions about education, work, and relationships in the United States. In the third line of inquiry, Dr. Davis has examined the processes through which inequality is reproduced or undermined in higher education, with an eye toward underscoring the role that undergraduate research can play in changing the future of the professoriate. Dr. Davis is incredibly prolific. She's authored over 60 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, is the co-editor of the book Gender in the 21st Century, The Stalled Revolution and the Road to Equality, the co-author of 2 additional books, Methods of Research on Human Development and Families, and Why Who Cleans Counts, What Housework Reveals About Power Dynamics in American Family Life. Dr. Davis is an award-winning teacher and mentor. She received the Teaching Excellence Award from Mason in 2013, the Outstanding Mentor Award from Oscar for her work with undergraduate researchers in 2012, and was an inaugural winner of the Sustaining Mentoring Award, again from Oscar, in 2019. She has also received the Catherine S. Lowney Mentoring Award from the Society for the Study of Social Problems in 2018. I've known Shannon more informally. I've known Shannon since she was a graduate student at NC State University, and I was an assistant professor at Wake Forest. And so spending the last decade working sort of across the quad from Shannon has been just an absolute pleasure and a real bright point of my time at Mason. So she's an acclaimed author, an award-winning mentor, and I would suggest, as they say in the airlines, sit back, relax, and enjoy, because we are in for a show. Thank you for coming.
Angie, that was very kind. Thank you. I appreciate it. So we are doing things differently today. I will do my best to ensure that we have few technological challenges, and one of the ways that I'm going to do that is that I am going to remove my video while I'm giving my talk. Part of it is as those of us who are teaching online are trying to get people to focus their attention, I don't need you to focus on my head. I want you to focus on my words. I want you to focus on the conversation that I'm beginning with you. And so to do that, I'm going to turn off my video, but I promise I'm not leaving. I will then show you my PowerPoint presentation, and then we'll begin our conversation. All right, so here we go. You can still hear me, correct? Excellent. Thank you for the thumbs up. Thank you so much. All right. So I also want to acknowledge the fact that we're doing this in a creative and unique way. To be able to be a part of the Scholars Lecture history is, to me, humbling, and I'm greatly appreciative of this honor and this opportunity. I'm also appreciative of the fact that joining us today are people who may not be able to join us when we have this opportunity face to face, to include folks that I've known for a very long time who are part of my intellectual community and my family. And so I'd like to say thank you and welcome to those folks. Thank you and welcome to all who are part of Women and Gender Studies at Mason, and all who have been a part of my community from my time as an early undergraduate until now. So I'm going to do 3 things today. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the findings in my recent book published with Ted Greenstein, Why Who Cleans Counts. I'm also going to tell you how the book came to be, the story of the book. And finally, I'm going to make a case for an inclusive umbrella of feminist scholarship, with a couple of comments perhaps aimed at the graduate students and undergraduates who might be tuning in today. So, housework. We all talk about housework. We all think about housework, or sometimes we think about housework. Maybe if you, well, the last time that you were able to go to the grocery store, you perused the periodicals there at the checkout line, and there was something about housework, keeping your house clean, keeping other people on task, keeping the house clean. But largely we talk about housework because we hate doing it. In fact, if we were to peruse Pinterest for even a half of a moment, we would be able to see some memes and some other decorations, perhaps magnets or other photographs that have been taken that document how much women hate housework. You know what would make house cleaning way more fun? A maid. I don't want to brag, but I'm pretty mediocre at housekeeping, but I'm pretty awesome at margaritas. My housekeeping style is best described as there appears to have been a struggle. If insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results, then I guess I'll stop cleaning the house. Martha Stewart would choke on her craft supplies if she saw how I wad up a fitted sheet. The only thing I hate more than having a dirty house is cleaning. Note that these pictures, other than the one of the cute cat, are all women. Not only do we talk about housework among our friends and family, or perhaps read about it in the house in the checkout counter at the grocery store, but social scientists also spend a little bit of time talking about housework. In fact, among social scientists, housework is a regular topic of inquiry. I was in graduate school at NC State from 1998 to 2004. This was a time when housework research flourished and became a cornerstone of family sociology. As a result, I was exposed to this area of research by my professor, who eventually became my mentor, co-author, and friend, Ted Greenstein. Under his guidance, my MA thesis focused on gender ideology and divorce, and my dissertation examined perceptions of fairness in the division of household labor. We began publishing together while I was in grad school, including articles on housework that are included in the graph in front of you. Ted taught me a lot over the years, both formally and informally. After graduating NC State, I went to UNC Chapel Hill for a postdoc and then was hired here at Mason in 2006. Ted and I continued to talk and continued to write together. Ted was the author of a research methods textbook for studying families and was interested in publishing a research monograph on housework. Being untenured at the time, I was very interested in thinking about this as well. Our first set of ideas led us to propose a special session on why we study housework for the American Sociological Association annual meetings. From there, we proposed a special issue of Journal Family Theory and Review. This special issue gave us and the other authors the space to think about why it is that we study housework as social scientists. Our original idea was to take these and some other authors and have them revise their contribution, find empirical pieces that provided evidence for their argument, and then summarize the value of housework to the field of family studies, but especially within sociology. We just couldn't get that idea off the ground. It turns out that editing a book like that is worse than herding cats, and I know I have cats. So we started thinking about our own theoretical idea as the origins of a monograph. In the meantime, I attended a conference in Scotland where I had the chance to meet with publishers from Policy Press, a UK-based publishing company. We talked about the Housework book idea, and the editor became interested in hearing more from us. And after some fits and starts, the rest, as they say, is history. If we're going to talk about housework, let's think about what it is that we're talking about. Most of the tasks that we refer to as housework are the routine tasks, the cooking, the cleaning, the laundry. But we also talk about paying bills, yard work, maintenance. And I want to make a specific point here. We are explicitly not talking about childcare. Those in family sociology recognize that while childcare and housework are connected to one another, they are in fact conceptually separate in the literature because of the different ways in which childcare and housework are valued within families. So today, we're speaking specifically about housework and household labor. The data that we used in our book is the National Survey of Families and Households, the first two waves, which were collected in 1988 and 1993. This data set has made a remarkable impression on the field, as it is the first and, to my knowledge, only data set of a nationally representative sample of couples, both married and unmarried. Both partners completed questionnaires providing information about their behaviors and attitudes. This couple-level data is invaluable to the study of households. Using the framework that others who have published with this data have used, we focused on 9 household tasks, organizing them around labels that are consistent with the literature. Typically feminine tasks, those in purple, typically masculine tasks, those in red, and neutral tasks, those in black. The measures here that we use are hours per week spent on the tasks. We performed latent profile analysis on these couple-level data, which basically seeks for patterns across couples and the distribution of tasks, and found that there were 5 classes of couples based upon that first wave of data. This is the overall distribution of tasks across the classes, where you can see that women were more likely to perform the traditionally feminine tasks and men the traditionally masculine ones, with some exceptions across the classes that I'll tell you more about in a moment. This is simply to give you a sense of the amount of time overall that people spent on those tasks. Ultra-traditional couples are characterized by a highly gendered division of housework tasks, with wives shouldering an enormous burden of time on traditionally feminine tasks. Differences between wives and their husbands are particularly large for the traditionally feminine tasks such as meal preparation, kitchen work, and cleaning, where wives spend an average of 47 hours per week compared to their husbands' 3.4 hours. However, ultra-traditional wives also spent the most time on masculine tasks of any of the classes. Traditional couples are characterized by much less overall housework being performed by both wives and their husbands. They perform a total of about 40 hours per week, about half of what the ultra-traditional couples do, even though there are still substantial differences between wives and their husbands, particularly on the feminine tasks. Although they do far less total housework, the distributions look relatively similar to those of the ultra-traditionals. And as a note, the traditional couples comprise the largest portion of the sample, just over half. Transitional husband couples show more participation in housework by husbands, an average of 21 hours per week compared to 30 hours for their wives, and much smaller differences on feminine tasks than either of the traditional groups. We labeled this group transitional husbands, as the husband's behavior reflected a transitional stage between the 2 traditional and 2 egalitarian groups. Their participation in housework for both husbands and wives is generally in the middle of the distributions for the entire sample. Egalitarian couples very nearly split the housework burden equally, 31 hours for wives, 30 hours for husbands, with much less differentiation on the feminine tasks than the three preceding groups. Husbands continue to perform substantially more of the masculine tasks, especially yard work, than do wives, even among these more egalitarian couples. And within this sample, their distributions are the most similar to the egalitarian high workload couples. This is the smallest of our 5 groups, about 5% of our nearly 4,000 couples. Compared to the other 4 groups, the egalitarian high workload couples are quite anomalous. This is the only group where husbands report doing more housework than their wives, 41 hours compared to 35 hours per week. Husbands and wives do almost the same amount of time on feminine tasks, 24 hours per week for wives, 22 hours per week for husbands. In fact, egalitarian high workload husbands do more hours of feminine tasks, almost 31 hours per week, than any of the other classes. However, husbands continue to outperform wives on masculine tasks, such as yard work and car maintenance. While the book dives into understanding factors that are correlated with the class that couples are placed in, my presentation today is going to focus on why we care about these distributions in the first place. Ted and I argue that understanding housework can help us understand how power is distributed within couples. Built on definitions of power, Emerson, Kitchener, and Luke's. We thought about overt power, that is to say, the ability to control decision-making and behaviors, and hidden or latent power, the ability to suppress issues through the successful resolution of those issues in the past to prevent their being brought up again. Emerson's power dependence theory argues that the power a person holds over another person resides in the control over the things that the other values. This set of relations is in a relationship where the actors are mutually dependent on one another. And an intimate relationship like a marriage certainly fits this description. One of Emerson's most important theoretical contributions was his argument that power is a property of social relations, not of social actors. Further, there is nothing in Emerson's perspective on power, nor indeed in most exchange-based formulations, that limits us to analyses of exchanges involving tangible commodities such as income. By expanding our analyses of power and exchange to include symbolic commodities, we are better able to take the context of the social relationship into consideration. When a woman and a man share a residence, regardless of what types of labor they performed in their previous households, the path of least resistance, that status quo, is for women to do the majority of tasks and spend more time on housework than men do. Power is then evidenced when women are able to do less than would be expected in these circumstances. In general, spouse who has either or both more absolute or relative material power, as measured by income or education, for example, has been theorized to be able to negotiate their way out of performing housework. However, the power dependence models that focus on these structural and material resources really only explain men's behavior. Further, individuals who believe that there is a gendered component to the division of paid and unpaid work not only attempt to enact that gendered division of labor through their own performance of housework, but may also either coerce, using power, or be coerced, acquiescing to power, into enacting that division of labor. Power is gendered, at least in the context of intimate or married relationships. The key goal of this research was to examine whether the distribution of housework, which is connected to structural sources of power, can be demonstrated to predict preferences and other behaviors in couples. Power dynamics have substantial implications within couples and can be exhibited through latent and hidden power or through overt power, as in physical or psychological manipulation of the other partner. We compared two arenas where power is exerted in couples: the economic sphere of influence, with latent and hidden power as the mechanisms, and conflict, measured as disagreements and physical violence. Comparing the distribution of perceptions and reported behaviors across the classes provides convincing evidence that housework can be considered a proxy for power. The figure that you see in front of you is a heuristic of the structural equation model that we performed to analyze the effects of class membership on the three consequences of preferred labor market hours, disagreements, and physical violence. We acknowledge that individual and couple level characteristics such as race, age, education, how long the couple has been together, affects these outcomes, but it also affects class membership. And so the analyses that I'm presenting to you today are the effects of class membership net of those individual and couple level characteristics. We thought about preferred labor market hours, the amount of time that individuals want to spend in the labor market, not the time that they actually spend, the hours of work that they perform each week in the paid labor market, but how much that they would like to perform, and use that as one of the ways in which we captured class consequences. Paid employment hours reflect financial need within a household, but can also be considered one means of demonstrating masculinity and femininity based on contemporary US gender norms. The literature on under and overemployment has documented patterns in how individuals work more or fewer hours in the labor market based upon their educational or other skills. They may not have consistency in those labor market hours based upon things like gender and marital status. Working more or fewer hours than one would like could reflect a mismatch between the individual's skills and the local labor market job opportunities. However, it could also reflect a power dynamic within the household, where one partner actively discourages another from working additional hours in the paid labor market and is able to exert latent power in the form of suppressing labor market participation. However, wanting to work more or fewer hours may also reflect the complex negotiations of power within the household that are in response to external forces. For example, it's possible that among couples where there is an expected gendered division of paid and unpaid work along more traditional lines, that both women and men may want men to work more and women to work less, but there are no jobs that would facilitate this arrangement. In fact, in the face of structural constraints where employment for traditional men is scarce, research has shown that men engage in gender deviance neutralization, where they refuse to perform tasks, including both paid work and housework, that they perceive may undermine their masculinity. Thus, we recognize that our analysis of concordance with preferred and actual labor market hours across the housework classes may not capture the full picture of how latent power is exerted within couples, nor the extent to which partners acquiesce to power being exerted. Having said that, there is some evidence of spouses using latent and hidden power to shape one another's labor market experience, and of spouses acquiescing to this exercise of power. Ultra-traditional women report preferring to work more than they do, while their husbands want them to work even fewer hours than they currently work. Both statistically significant differences. The struggle around women's participation in the public sphere through labor market hours in these couples is consistent with the cultural uniqueness of this group in the private sphere. Ultra-traditional husbands seem to want an almost completely gendered split of responsibilities for paid and unpaid work, for them to be the sole breadwinners and their wives to focus only on the home. Their connection to the prevailing cultural norms around breadwinning would allow them to exert this latent and/or hidden power in ways that seem natural in their interactions. Traditional couples' preferences are consistent with what we would expect for couples attempting to model a contemporary division of paid and unpaid work that continues to reflect some gender differentiation in the public and private spheres. Both spouses would prefer men to work more and traditional women to work less. Couples in the transitional husbands, egalitarian, and egalitarian high workload classes are internally consistent with one another and with what we would expect of their labor market preferences conceptually. As a result, there is little evidence of latent power over labor market experiences among couples in these three classes. Disagreements occur in relationships. The frequency with which they occur could reflect the power dynamics in the relationship, as disagreements could be indicative of a power struggle between partners. We first constructed an additive score of overall number of disagreements, where higher values reflect more overall disagreements, and we then evaluated class differences in frequency of specific disagreements, focusing on household tasks, money, spending time together, sex, children, and their in-laws. The egalitarian high workload class reports the most overall disagreements, making them statistically distinct from all other classes. Not surprisingly, they also report the most frequent disagreements over spending time together, given that this class is characterized by both spouses performing substantial amounts of housework. Consistent with previous scholarship, couples in the two traditional classes report the lowest overall disagreements and the lowest frequency of specific disagreements in almost every category for both women and men. The traditional classes represent a cultural norm in how the private sphere is organized, yielding an easier roadmap for couples. This emphasizes the power of the cultural norm of separate spheres and the roles that women and men play in the maintenance of the private sphere. Our multivariate analyses provide evidence that the housework dynamics and the egalitarian high workload class of couples are difficult to maintain, in part due to the fact that the couples are challenging culturally normative behavioral expectations. The egalitarian high workload couples are not more likely to disagree over household tasks than are other couples in other classes. However, with a high level of mutual focus on the household as their defining characteristic, the distinctiveness of the couples means that they had fewer cultural roadmaps to follow, fewer structural supports, and therefore were more likely to have disagreements. More importantly, they were most likely to report disagreements, net of other characteristics, signaling the willingness of the spouses to actively engage in constant negotiation and reinforcement of how they organized their household. These findings support our argument that household labor configurations can be seen as a proxy for power dynamics. Household labor configurations are fraught with cultural expectations of gender and power. These findings demonstrate that when household labor configurations are far from the cultural norm, there will be an increase in the likelihood that couples will be comfortable with actively constructing their own local norms and power configurations. When couples disagree, they have a variety of conflict resolution tactics they can use. These tactics may reflect power dynamics within the couple. There are two differences based on class membership in women's reports once other characteristics are considered: keeping opinions to self and discussing disagreements calmly. Women in the ultra-traditional couples were more likely to keep their opinions to themselves. This is indicative of the dynamics within the couples. And again, I'll note that because of the statistical analyses, we can say that this is not about selection into the class. These women may be performing emphasized femininity, where they behave in a manner that reinforces stereotypical cultural norms about gender in the relationship. By silencing themselves in response to their husband's behaviors, they are reaffirming the culturally traditional patterns of gendered behaviors and power dynamics. This behavior is consistent with our expectations if housework is seen as a proxy for power dynamics. Interestingly, while women in the egalitarian high workload couples report the highest number of disagreements, the multivariate analyses show that they are also significantly more likely to report that they discuss disagreements calmly. Despite that these couples have more disagreements, again, likely because of the minimal structural supports for their unusual household configuration, they are more likely to discuss calmly the situation that has led to the disagreement than are couples in other classes. This result again provides additional evidence of the uniqueness of the couples in the egalitarian high workload class, but also reflects the extent to which couples outside of the cultural norm are comfortable with actively constructing their own power configurations. One conflict resolution tactic that has been connected previously to the expression of power is intimate partner violence. Intimate partner violence reflects the exertion of power in a relationship, especially when perpetrated by men. When women have been documented to initiate intimate partner violence, often research shows that women's violent behavior can typically be considered self-defense or retaliation for violence or threats of violence by their partner. Overall, there were low levels of reports of intimate partner violence in our sample. However, women in traditional couples were significantly less likely to report that they had a physical argument in the previous year than were women in other couples. This difference could reflect a lower frequency of physical arguments in these couples relative to others. That would be consistent with the men's reports, although men's reports did not show a significant class difference. It could also reflect, however, an internalization of cultural norms around gendered violence that surround the stereotypical separate spheres household. Women in a, quote, traditional household, end quote, do not speak of physical arguments because that would imply that they are not performing their roles as wives appropriately and have to be reprimanded by their husbands. This line of victim blaming argumentation is often used to explain why many women do not report intimate partner violence. Our argument is that housework can be seen as a proxy for power dynamics in the household. If we understand how housework is divided, we can gain insight into how couples make decisions and how spouses attempt to influence one another's behavior. Overall, there is some support for viewing the division of housework within couples as a proxy for household power dynamics. Men and women exert latent power in structuring how much time in the labor market their spouse may want to spend. Both men and women exert overt power through the use of verbal disagreements and with physical violence. Again, while not a deterministic model, our classification of couples by housework performance does provide insight into the power dynamics among US couples in the late 1980s. Yes, the data are old. While this is problematic, if the purpose of the research is to make generalizations about the exact housework behavior of contemporary couples, that wasn't our goal. We are using these data to investigate whether and how the distribution of housework between wives and their husbands can be seen as an indicator or proxy for power in their relationship. In other words, our concern with the empirical evidence is more theoretical and conceptual than it is descriptive. While the exact parameters of housework have undoubtedly changed in the last 30 years, we believe that the conceptual and theoretical connections between housework and power within couples have not, making our empirical investigation relevant for both contemporary and future social scientific discussions about families and households. Counselors working with couples regularly introduce discussions about the division of housework into their sessions. This information not only can be used to highlight expectations from both spouses regarding their roles within the family, but based on our work, can also provide insight into the potential subtle ways that spouses are exerting power over one another. As we have documented some patterns of restricting or encouraging access to the labor market and conflict resolution tactics based on the division of housework, we argue that practitioners counseling couples can use our work as another tool to assess potential risk within couples. As researchers and family sociologists, we are not qualified to tell counselors how to work with their clients. But if our work can be used as a tool to aid counselors and other family practitioners to work with couples to become happier and healthier, then we would like to be able to contribute to that effort. Housework is more than simply doing the laundry, preparing meals, and mowing the grass. Housework is a reflection of individual preferences and negotiated expectations between partners, complicated by the expectations that others place upon women and men that are connected to how well they conform to gendered norms. Our work has demonstrated that to understand the division of housework within heterosexual couples is to have insight into the power dynamics, both overt and hidden, within the couple. These power dynamics reflect the give and take of family life, where couples attempt to bring their beliefs and expectations and behaviors into congruence. The reciprocal relationship between time and paid and unpaid tasks that is documented in our work highlights the value of studying housework to understand overt, latent, and hidden power. As families in the United States continue to construct and reconstruct their household-level norms amidst changing geopolitical, cultural, and economic forces, one fact will still remain. Household tasks will still need to be performed. Who cleans counts because cleaning and other household tasks highlight the potential for both women and men to be part of their ideal relationships, potentially yielding greater equality and/or happiness. We hope that this book can facilitate opportunities for both. I want to conclude with a little bit of a comment, given that I am in a space with women and gender studies. Talk a little bit about how it is that in that decade of work that Angie and I have been working together, that I've come to think about my role as a feminist scholar. Angie and I hit our heads on the wall for about a year as we were working collectively on student projects as committee members and running into the continual concern of students that research that does not include qualitative methods, that does not include qualitative data, can't be feminist research. And therefore, the rest of that research is the problem. I question what makes research feminist. Feminist research, in my opinion, is research that problematizes inequality, seeks to understand how inequality is reproduced, and seeks to undermine the reproduction of inequality. And methods are simply tools. Recognizing, of course, that the tools have a history, that they have been used for many purposes, but all tools can be used for many and varied purposes. The tools that we use to do our research do not define us and do not define what we see the purpose of our research to be. I would argue that all scholars of the current era, regardless of where you are in your journey as a scholar, we must be fluent in multiple methodologies if we are going to engage in work that is feminist. If we seek to undermine the reproduction of inequality, we have to understand how our work and others' work can enable us to do so. And if we cannot understand others' work, whether it be a narrative form, whether it be an advanced statistical model, we cannot perhaps see the ability of that data, those findings, to help us understand one component of inequality. I see one of our responsibilities as feminist scholars then to not only be the best scholar that we can be, to produce our best scholarship, but also to find ways to make our work relevant, whether it be at the local, state, or federal level with regard to policy, providing narrative and demographic information to document how processes work differently for different people. Or perhaps, as we're trying to do with our book, to provide evidence that can give practitioners and activists something else to work with as they attempt to create change. And if we can't do it ourselves, find other smart people who can help us translate our work. How can we collectively form a community to bring work together, to translate our narrative, to translate our demographic or sophisticated quantitative modeling, to be able to work together to not only understand how inequality is reproduced, but to attempt to undermine it? I think as one of the honored people to be able to be a part of the Scholars Lecture for Women and Gender Studies at George Mason University, I hope that we collectively as a community continue to seek ways to bridge those gaps, to use our scholarship of whatever form to be able to work towards a brighter future. Thank you.
All right. Well, virtual round of applause for Shannon and a really fantastic lecture. So I know after such a thought-provoking talk that there are many questions in the audience. So I am asking that everybody we're using our kindergarten skills today, raises their hands virtually. And then I will take care of making sure your question is recognized. And again, if you're not speaking, we would appreciate it if you stayed on mute. So we'll take questions now for Shannon. Don't be shy, folks.
I had a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, this is Tamara. So Shannon, did I have it right that you were suggesting that you were saying that there was more conflict in the high work egalitarian group, more conflict that was reported, and your assumption was that that was because there weren't models for those kinds of relationships, and so people had to work it out through a conflict, or you had a different disagreement. Yeah. I have it scrawled down. It's horrible. It's like holding a pen in my computer. Could some of that be because instead those kinds of relationships, any kind of egalitarian household relationship, requires more negotiation, right? Like it's just how it works. It's not because there no models, and I know that it's probably a both and, but I'm wondering how you decide between those two.
Yeah, great question, Tamara. So I would argue that because there was a distinction in the two egalitarian classes, if we would expect that egalitarian couples writ large would have a requirement of more negotiation and more discussion around how to proceed, we would have expected to see that the egalitarian couples would have been similar to the high workload egalitarian high workload couples in their levels of disagreement. The egalitarian high workload couples were statistically distinct from all other classes. And so in this particular case, I agree in general that while the egalitarian couples with slightly higher levels of disagreements, they were not the same as this egalitarian high workload group. I think that your point is absolutely well taken, however, in that when one does not engage in culturally prescribed status quo approaches of relationships, negotiation must be required. But in these couples, it was distinctly different than the others.
All right, Angie has a question.
Shannon, first of all, oh my gosh, bravo. Like my head is spinning, like I'm unbelievable. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Probably not a surprise to anybody. My question is going to be about your thinking around housework and intimate partner violence. And so one of the things that we found in our research was that couples who were living with violence and engaging in intimate partner violence were negotiating two things. We called it role conflict and rule conflict. And so rule conflict was a disagreement over who's doing stuff, right? Like, I need you to do that. I don't like the way you did that, et cetera. The other concept, role conflict or role reinforcement, was really about, I need you to do that thing because I need you to act like you're supposed to, right? So it was kind of, I need you to cook my dinner at 6 o'clock because I like my dinner at 6 o'clock, but also you're supposed to cook for me. And so I was really intrigued by your finding that this was higher in the higher traditional couples, which is where we would also expect higher rates of IPD. So I'm just curious how you might unpack that.
I would say that your findings with the qualitative data with those interviews are exactly consistent with what we found with the traditional couples. At least in this case, again, that the traditional women were themselves distinctly different than the other women and men, frankly, but the other women within the sample, that they themselves were differently willing to document that they had been in a physical altercation or using physical means of resolving conflict within the past year. And I would argue that that's precise. Your analysis is precisely accurate in that these folks who themselves would expect a particular set of roles to be enacted when they aren't, are more likely to engage in behaviors that attempt to get, particularly the person who perceives that they have more power in that relationship, or who has in that set of exchanges has more power, works to ensure that their perspective is the one that is modeled. And that's certainly consistent with other quantitative literature. I'm thinking about something that Maxine Atkinson, Molly Wang, and Ted Greenstein wrote, where they were exactly looking at the extent to which that breadwinning could be a challenge. Attitudes about breadwinning could be a challenge for women and men whenever they saw discrepancies, and how people's actual behaviors, what they looked like regarding their beliefs about gender. So certainly that is consistent with what these findings demonstrated with the traditional women. And I think it's also interesting to be thinking about that your work, as well as our work, is using data from a slightly different time period, right? But yet I'm seeing people who have their video on, their heads are nodding, right? The conceptual arguments make sense, despite the fact that the data are not from this year or this decade, quite frankly, right? And this actually speaks to, I see there are probably other hands, but I do want to sort of take us sort of back to full circle, that one of the key things that I'm drawn to by our work here is the fact that we're not trying to make a case that these are the 5 types of couples that exist in the United States right now. Because I suspect and not even like right now with COVID-19, but like right now in general. I suspect that if we were to perform a similar kind of analysis with couples looking at distribution of tasks in the 2000s, the distributions would look different because of the ways in which housework has shifted. But the ways in which we negotiate and in our capitalist society privilege some kinds of mechanisms to support who has the ability to do things or not in a relationship, that hasn't shifted very much. So I would argue that your findings and ours, both from a different time, would actually still be consistent conceptually with how contemporary American couples, and I'll argue here, while our book focused on heterosexual couples, I would make the case that certainly couples who are not self-defined as heterosexual would also see similar kinds of patterns because of the ways in which power has been constructed within relationships. And there's some of the old literature on LGBTQ couples demonstrates that. Some of the newer literature, particularly that coming out of community psychology, is complicating that relationship. But what I will say is that I believe that these conceptual relationships between power and beliefs about gender and how they are enacted in couples absolutely would be consistent with what we would see today. I see a question about what would show up differently today. I would say two key things. First, people who are married today look different than the people who were married in 1988, right? The demographics of who is married looks different. And so we would need to think a little bit about the extent to which, and our analysis wasn't only focused on married couples, we also included cohabiting couples. We would need to think differently about what that set of selection characteristics into the sample might look like and how that might differentially affect the housework classes themselves. In part because we see differences in greater variability in the kinds of places where people live. We also see on the flip side more of a panopticon with how it is that we are judged by others vis-a-vis what we do in our homes. Those of you who have been doing online instruction, some of my friends at least have been commenting that, oh my God, people can see into my home. What does that mean for our performance? In the last decade or so, we have shifted what we share about ourselves, and as a result have shifted what we share about who we think we are relative to our partners, our children, our parents, our friends, and as a result, how we are performing gender. In the space we live in right now, if we think about the framework of doing gender, the idea behind that particular theoretical framework is that we are held accountable to particular sets of expectations about what women and men are in a particular time period. That accountability is heightened when we literally see each other all the time. There's almost no backstage. And so I would argue that the performance of housework, the reporting of the performance of housework at least, will look different in the contemporary era because there's a greater likelihood that performance is literally being done in a visible space.
Earl Smith has a question.
All right.
Hello.
Hi, Earl.
How you doing? In the early 70s, there was a woman professor from England, I think, Oakley,
Mm-hmm.
and we had the privilege of her book had just come out, and she was giving a lecture, brown bag lecture at the con, and people were sort of snickering and giggling about the focus of her research. Like, what is this all about? Why are sociologists spending this time fooling with something like housework?
Right.
And who does what? And people start talking about tacking pages on their refrigerator, and the wife's part was on the left and the husband's part was on the right, and who did the dishes and the garbage and took out the garbage, that kind of thing. What in your findings has moved beyond where that research was in the early 70s?
Well, that's a great question. So I'm going to go beyond this book, Earl. I'm going to add this book, but I'm going to go beyond it. So Oakley's work was actually part of the introduction of my dissertation. And so as you're saying this, I'm being taken back a little time. But in thinking about at that point in time, studying the households was something that was either well, yeah, of course, women are going to study this, right? So it wasn't even it wasn't even a legitimate topic of study because women weren't legitimate scientists, right? So there's that piece. And second, it particularly as we were as a discipline and as a country sort of reimagining who we were in the 1970s, and then moving into the 80s. I would go back to the PowerPoint if we were like live, but I'm not going to mess with that right now. If we think about the trajectory of housework research, it really started taking off in the 1980s, but most particularly late 80s, early 90s. There are two reasons I would argue this occurred. First, more men started studying housework because of its connection to the paid labor market. Right? Economists recognize that if you spend more time in one, you spend less time in the other. That's the time availability theory, one of the earliest theories around the performance of housework. As women moved out of the home into the labor market, they spent less time doing housework. So who was doing the housework? Because men weren't, right? There was no acknowledgement about men doing housework. So economists started paying attention to this. Men started paying attention to this. We started to see this in other disciplines, as well as in sociology, becoming a phenomenon worth studying. So that's one shift that I will argue. A second shift is because attention started being paid, more data started to be collected. That was not town-specific, university-specific, but in fact, we started seeing large nationally representative data sets. The NSFH is beautiful, old but beautiful, unprecedented in its ability to get access to families. It came out in 1987-88, right? The data were collected in 87-88, the exact time when as a country, as a discipline, as social scientists, started thinking about families in ways that were critical. We think about, the time period in which those data were being collected. There was the focus on the family, a concern with women being in the labor market, what was happening to children. We just passed the tipping point with more marriages ending in divorce than in death. There was a heightened concern about the family, right? More data, more money was put into that, more interest was being put into that. And as a result, we saw the General Social Survey, while it's again one partner, start asking questions about it. We saw the NSFH and then other kinds of data sets. So there's scholarly interest shifted, which has given us a lot of things to think about within the discipline. And we also then started having broader conversations across people who have been doing demographic work and people who are doing ethnographic work to actually talk to each other and think about how the two were maybe matching and mirroring the same kinds of social processes. But I would say also in that time period since Oakley's work came out, not only do we have more women in the discipline who are doing a broader number of kinds of things, more men doing a broader number of kinds of things, we also have a greater recognition as a scientific community of the ways in which that social processes outside of the household influence what's happening inside of the household and vice versa. And we have more sophisticated theoretical models for the two. We've had a change in global theoretical investigations, but it also, sort of, we want to think about just within the United States, about gender inequality not simply being only at the macro level or only what happens inside of the home, but that all of these things are connected to one another. And as a result of that strong theoretical movement within social sciences more broadly, as well as in philosophy, we have seen a greater emphasis on connecting empirically what's happening at the national level with what's happening at the local household level. And so I would argue that much of the research that has shifted in housework, in like the housework research, has been engaged in that next step of where theory has gone, how we can then investigate how those multiple levels of theory are integrated with one another. How do we see that enacted in everyday life at the household level, both through ethnographic qualitative data collection mechanisms, as well as more demographic or systematically collected quantitative data. So those are the big, sort of the big conceptual answers, as opposed to the specific empirical answers to your question. Thanks.
Other questions?
I want to say one thing, David, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
I first want to give a shout out. I saw that Ted Greenstein was on this earlier. I want to say thank you to Ted for joining us. I don't know if he's still here, but I want to say thank you to him. And I want to say to students, Katie, I will get you in a sec. I want to say to students, this work and the relationship that Ted and I have had since I started grad school in 1998 is something that you all can think about developing through the relationships that you have with your faculty members, but also through your grad school and undergrads with your peers. I am privileged to be a part of a community of scholars that is now is a global space, and I encourage you to be willing to take risks, to start a project without knowing the end point, and to be willing to make that offer of, I don't know where this is going to go, but these are interesting questions. Let's continue to write about it. Let's continue to talk about it. Because I didn't know when I started grad school in 1998 that I would be in this space. So don't be afraid to take risks. Don't be afraid to ask questions, and don't be afraid to go out on a limb. As many of you know, I am a quantitative scholar who just spent the last hour talking largely about how data tell us about what they tell us about theory, right? And so don't be afraid to also step out of that comfort zone just a little bit too. So Katie, you had a question.
I've had my backstage, front stage nightmare going on, and the kindergarten raising hands. I've been having to teach both my sons in school right now for that. The question I had was towards your latter point about the, for lack of a better word, acceptance of qualitative work or quantitative work as feminist research, and with the fact that the data you were having to work with, which again at the time starting this project was pretty avant-garde, if you will, at the time. Well, now that we've started to shift the language of what's going on in home management and housework to include emotional labor and cognitive labor, is the possibility of changing that language, much like we changed the language for qualitative research to include feminist terms. Do you think including these new categories of household labor will help adjust the quantitative capture of that experience in the house?
Yes. So the American Time Use data, the American Time Use study collects data on individuals, right? So the NSFH is beautiful because it has couples, right? and it has all sorts of other great things too, but we're just gonna like focus on that. That American time use data captures literally with a time diary what people are doing every minute of the day. And if they're multitasking, that is to say, if they're doing one thing but thinking about something else, they're asked to write that down. And so with that particular data, you are afforded the opportunity, and there's some great scholars. So Alexandra Killewald at Harvard has been doing a lot of this work, thinking about the ways in which people are multitasking. If we think about the psychologist terms, right? Multitasking. They literally could be doing two tasks at the same time, but some of that is the cognitive work. Some of that is not only the emotional work, but as you know, the cognitive work. I think many of us who have caregiving responsibilities, whether it be for children or for parents or for both, are doing that cognitive work of planning out schedules, making sure, for example, if you have a parent that needs a medication schedule, ensuring that they've got everything that they need. Right now with COVID-19, did it all get mailed to them? Do they have access to everything that they need for their medications, their testing supplies? That's cognitive work that you're doing at the same time that you may be preparing dinner or folding laundry. Or asking someone else to do that work so that you can ensure that they have a good responsibility instilled in them, right? Because that's also work, right? So there has been, because of the changes in measurement tools, a recognition of some of the conceptual changes and developments in the literature generally. And this also, I would argue, is a really good example of how cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary work is occurring, right? Where we can learn from the social psychologists and the psychologists about how to measure things, but then how we can also take to them and steal from them some of the ways in which that measurement can be used to grasp some of the conceptual arguments that we've been making. Yeah. So, if we could get several $1 million to be able to do the American Time Use study with couples and follow them over time, which is another beautiful piece of the NSFH, there were 3 waves of those data. The American Time Use study is not a panel study. And so if we were then able to, right, so there are some, there's some challenges. But I do think that if we were to create an ideal scenario, we would blend these conceptual notions of how we understand housework to look now, right? Because some of that also might include paying someone else to do the work. Who makes that ask? Who pays the bill? Who supervises if one is privileged enough to be able to do that? That's still work. So I think that we could potentially do all sorts of really cool and interesting things.
For a couple more questions, let me find. After Katie's, there's been a lot in the chat lately, so sorry. One is, what do you think, if anything, this data says about how society views house cleaning jobs in and outside of the home?
That's a great question. Not much about outside of the home, right? Not much about housework as a paid job. We don't have anything in this particular data set because we were focusing on what people were doing as unpaid work. I would say there's a lot of great literature on women, right, who are doing housework for others for pay. And that certainly comes out of the intersectionality literature, recognizing who these women are, their immigrant status, their race, ethnicity, and nationality, their ability to use the skills that they have for different kinds of employment. But we also see in that exact same literature opportunities for women to create their own businesses, to become entrepreneurs, to be able to have a different direction for themselves than perhaps they would have in other circumstances. So I would say these data don't say anything about women who are being paid to clean other people's homes, but it does tell us, but there's a nice literature on that. What these data do tell us is that cultural norms are powerful. Cultural norms are malleable, but powerful. And what our data suggest is without structural supports, couples who attempt to push back against cultural norms run into a lot of difficulties. Now let's expand that theoretically. That then would include couples who don't look like the traditional heterosexual couple for whatever reason, whether it be age differences, whether it be that they're not heterosexual, whether it be race or ethnicity, whether it be they choose to go down a path of not getting married ever, or they've been married many, many, many times, and that's just what they do. If there are not structural supports, as in our case with the egalitarian high workload couples, for couples who choose to do things differently, if there are not those structural supports, they run into challenges, and it is difficult for them to maintain that change. Now, one could theorize, flipping it, if we lived in a world where the expectation was equality and couples wanted something that was unequal, that they too would run into difficulties, right? That's the flip side of the theoretical argument. We don't live in that world. We don't live in the world where a traditional division of labor is not supported. We live in a world where there's an expectation that a house is clean, and if there's a woman in the house, it is expected to be her responsibility. And if there are two men in the home, then that expectation typically culturally has fallen on the man who has less economic or other kinds of power opportunities. And so what these data have taught me more than anything else is that if we want to work towards equality, we have to have a two-pronged approach. We need to change the structural supports for equality, and we need to change the cultural supports for equality, right? And this to me is consistent with pretty much everything else that I've understood in my scholarship in the world, but this is something we can grab onto. What are the structural supports that are needed? Equal opportunities for people to be able to secure economic desires as they wish, and for people to be able to live their lives as women and men in ways that are not, that don't require them to behave in particular ways that tie them to norms that yield unequal opportunities. That would be my Pollyanna moment for the day. But what it also, again, what this book has taught me, what this work has taught me, what my career up until now has taught me, is that we have continual accumulation of data and theoretical understanding of how to move forward. The next thing is to take those next steps to enact it.
And then another question that was in the chat was, are there any racial or ethnic differences?
The answer to that is yes, and there are like 5 asterisks beside it, because race and ethnicity was one of the key characteristics that we used as a predictor of class, of the housework class, right? And so when I talk about class, I'm meaning the housework classes themselves. What we saw in particular, and we had race, ethnicity, religion, age, educational attainment, occupation, how long the couple had been together, whether or not they were cohabiting, how many children they had. I'm missing something, I'm sure. But yes, there were racial and ethnic differences in the prediction of class itself. And if we think back to that heuristic, right, that triangle, the individual and couple level differences predicted class and some of these outcomes. I would like to focus more on the prediction of class. And so what we saw was that the class, the egalitarian high workload class, was the least white. They were the couples that were, the partners themselves may not have been of the same race, and they were least likely to be white overall. So that also came back to underlying our argument of that couple, that's that class of couples having less structural supports. That's also about they're looking different than other couples across the classes and having less structural support for being a couple that may have been multiracial or may have been not white in general. So that in the 1988 data collection, that mattered in particular. And so, yes, there were differences, especially in that egalitarian high workload group. But in other groups, in the other classes, there was less difference in racial or ethnic variation across, or distribution across the classes.
Thank you. Other questions? Any final ones? Well, then another round of applause for a fantastic scholars lecture. Thank you, Shannon. And for those of you that are free at 3 o'clock, you may have already RSVP'd, but if you haven't, we are having a more intimate conversation and with Wendy Manuel Scott on navigating the academy as a woman. And this is in collaboration with Graduate Student Life. Julie put the WebEx link in the chat, but it might have gotten lost by now, so I'm going to do that again. Thank you, Julie. You thought of it before me. And so if you're coming to that, we'll see you at 3 o'clock. And thank you again, Shannon. This was great.
My pleasure. Thanks to all of you. I hope everyone stays safe and healthy.